My name is Natalie Anderson, 35 years old, living a quiet civilian life that hides my classified past. Tonight I am meeting my sister Elizabeth at Hamilton, an upscale restaurant where she will undoubtedly showcase her perfect life while treating me like the family disappointment. Little does she know that beneath my simple blazer lies the history of a decorated general. Her husband Thomas works in military intelligence, but has never connected the dots about my true identity. The revelation coming will change everything. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and please hit that like and subscribe button if you are ready to see my sister choke on her expensive water. Growing up in Brookline, Massachusetts, in a stately brownstone with manicured gardens and a 3-car garage, my family was the picture of East Coast success and privilege. The Anderson name carried weight in Boston social circles, with my father running a prestigious law firm and my mother chairing 3 different charity boards. Our family legacy was built on achievement, prestige, and maintaining appearances at all costs. Elizabeth, my younger sister, by 3 years embodied everything my parents valued. From an early age, she was methodical, disciplined, and laser-focused on success. While I climbed trees and played soldiers with the neighborhood kids, Elizabeth was winning spelling bees and playing violin at recitals. By high school, she was class president valedictorian and headed to Harvard with a perfect GPA. My parents beamed at every award ceremony, every accomplishment pointing to her as the model child. I was different, not rebellious exactly, but driven by a deeper sense of purpose that my family never quite understood. When I announced my decision to join the military, instead of attending my father's alma mater to study law, the disappointment in our household was palpable. The military, Natalie. With your intelligence, what a waste, my mother had said, barely looking up from her charity gala seating chart. My father was more direct. No Anderson has ever served in the military. We are leaders in business and law, not cannon fodder. Their words stung, but I held firm. What I could never explain to them was the call I felt to serve, to protect, to be part of something larger than our family's narrow definition of success. So I left home at 18 with my parents' reluctant blessing that felt more like resignation. What my family never knew was how quickly I ascended through the ranks. My analytical mind, strategic thinking, and natural leadership abilities caught the attention of superiors early. By 25, I had completed 3 tours, earned multiple commendations, and was being fast-tracked through officer training. By 30, I had achieved the rank of brigadier general, one of the youngest women ever to do so, specializing in intelligence operations and strategic defense. But I kept my accomplishments hidden from my family. Part pride, part hurt, I let them believe I was just another soldier. During holiday visits, I deflected questions about my work with vague references to administrative duties. Meanwhile, Elizabeth married Thomas Walker, a rising star in military intelligence, who ironically worked under my command chain without ever knowing his sister-in-law was several ranks above him. After 15 years of service, including classified operations that saved thousands of lives but would never make headlines, I made the difficult decision to retire. The toll of command, of making life and death decisions, had begun to weigh heavily. I wanted something simpler, more grounded. With my pension and savings, I opened a small security consulting firm in Boston, taking on civilian clients and the occasional government contract that could benefit from my expertise without requiring security clearance. My return to civilian life and proximity to my family only highlighted the divide between us. Elizabeth had become even more successful with 2 perfect children, a sprawling house in Cambridge, and a social circle that included senators and CEOs. Her husband Thomas had recently been promoted to lieutenant colonel, working directly under Commander Alexander Hayes, one of the most respected military leaders in the country. Last month at my nephew's birthday party, Elizabeth cornered me by the punch bowl. "Still with your little security business, Natalie? You know father could get you a proper position at the firm if you would just ask." Her tone carried that familiar mix of pity and condescension that I had learned to weather like a summer storm. "I am doing fine, Elizabeth," I replied, sipping my punch. "My business is growing steadily." "Growing? You work out of a 1-bedroom apartment," she laughed. "At your age, I was already managing a team of 30 and had purchased our second vacation property." I nodded and smiled, letting her words wash over me. If she only knew that I had commanded bases with thousands of personnel, managed operations with 9-figure budgets, and made decisions that shaped international security policy. But I stayed silent, protecting both my privacy and her worldview. 3 days ago, Elizabeth called with a dinner invitation that was clearly meant as another opportunity to showcase her success. "We are hosting dinner at Hamilton on Friday," she announced. "Thomas is inviting some colleagues from his unit, and I thought it might be good for you to network. Who knows, maybe you will meet someone who needs a security guard." The laugh that followed made it clear this was not a gesture of genuine help. I almost declined, but something told me to accept. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding in the shadows of my own accomplishments. Not to boast, but simply to stand in my truth. "That sounds lovely," I replied. "What time should I arrive?" 7:30, she said, sounding slightly surprised by my acceptance. "And Natalie, do try to dress appropriately. Hamilton has standards." As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. Little did Elizabeth know that Hamilton was where military brass often held their private dinners, a place I had frequented as a general. Friday would be interesting indeed. On Friday evening, I stood before my closet considering my options. Despite Elizabeth assuming I could not afford proper attire, my wardrobe contained several high-quality pieces from my years in command positions. I selected a simple navy blazer with subtle gold buttons, cream silk blouse, and tailored black trousers. The outfit was modest but exuded quiet confidence, much like my leadership style had been. As I fastened my grandmother's pearl earrings, my phone buzzed with a text from Samantha Jefferson, my former aide-de-camp, who now worked at the Pentagon. Operation Nightshade details secured. "Secretary needs your input on Moscow implications. Call when available." I smiled slightly. Just 3 weeks ago, I had consulted on a covert extraction operation in Eastern Europe, helping design the intelligence-gathering phase that preceded the actual mission. The operation had been successful, with all American assets secured without casualties. These consulting projects kept me connected to my former life, while allowing me the peace of civilian existence. I texted back, "Available tomorrow morning. Congratulations on successful execution." Then added, "Family dinner tonight at Hamilton. Wish me luck." Her response was immediate. "Hamilton? Isn't that where Hayes hosts the Joint Chiefs dinners? Your cover might be blown, General." "Worth the risk," I replied, then set my phone aside. As I applied a touch of lipstick, I contemplated the strange dichotomy of my life. To my family, I was Natalie, the underachiever, the sister who had squandered her potential on a military career that had apparently led nowhere. To national security officials, I was General Anderson, decorated strategist, whose operational frameworks were still taught at West Point. The drive to Hamilton took 20 minutes, winding through Boston traffic, until I reached the historic district where the restaurant occupied a restored 19th-century building. Its stone facade and discreet signage belied the opulence within. I pulled up to the valet stand, noting the collection of luxury vehicles already parked in the circular drive. The young valet opened my door, his eyes widening slightly as I stepped out. "Good evening, Ma," he began, then caught himself. I could see the recognition in his eyes, followed by professional restraint. He had undoubtedly seen me here before arriving for military dinners. "Just Natalie tonight, Jason," I said, reading his name tag. "Joining a family dinner." "Yes, ma'am," he replied with a slight nod that bordered on a habitual salute. "Enjoy your evening." Inside, the restaurant glowed with warm lighting that reflected off dark wood paneling and brass fixtures. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, and the air carried hints of truffle and aged whiskey. The hostess, a poised woman in her 50s named Diane, according to her name badge, looked up from her reservation book. "Welcome to Hamilton," she began. Then recognition flickered across her face. "Oh, it is a pleasure to have you with us this evening." Before I could respond, Elizabeth appeared beside me, her sleek black dress and diamond pendant, announcing her status more loudly than words ever could. "I am here, Natalie," she said, her eyes narrowing at the hostess's warm greeting. "Table is under Walker." Diane nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Walker. Your party is already seated. Please follow me. As we walked through the main dining room, I noticed several familiar faces among the patrons, high-ranking officials, and political figures who nodded subtly in my direction. Elizabeth mistook their acknowledgement for recognition of her own importance, standing straighter as we proceeded to a large round table where Thomas and two other couples were already seated. Everyone, this is my sister, Natalie Elizabeth, announced with a tone that suggested she was introducing a slightly embarrassing distant relative. Natalie, this is Dr. and Mrs. Lawrence Prescott and Judge and Mrs. Dr. William Harrison. And of course you remember Thomas. Thomas rose with a warm smile. At least my brother-in-law had always been kind if oblivious to my connection to his professional world. Natalie, good to see you again, he said, giving me a brief hug. Please have a seat. I took the empty chair between Thomas and Dr. Prescott, smoothing my napkin across my lap as Elizabeth launched into a story about her recent charity gala that had raised $200,000 for children with rare diseases. The governor himself commended our efforts, she was saying, her voice carrying just loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. We are already planning next year's event, which we hope will double the proceeds. Dr. Prescott's wife, Lauren, leaned toward me with a practiced society smile. And what is it that you do, Natalie? Elizabeth mentioned something about security. I could feel Elizabeth tense beside me, preparing to minimize my career before I could answer. I run a consulting firm, I replied simply. We provide security assessments and strategic planning for various clients. How interesting, Lauren said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. Is that like installing alarm systems? Elizabeth laughed lightly. Natalie has always been interested in that sort of thing. Even as a child, she was climbing trees and playing war games while I was studying. I smiled, letting the condescension roll off me like rain. Something like that, I replied to Lauren, though we focus more on strategy than installation. The waiter approached our table with practiced grace. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I start you with something from the bar? His eyes met mine, and I saw the flicker of recognition. Lovely to see you again, ma'am, he said quietly, before addressing the table at large. Elizabeth frowned slightly. You have been here before, Natalie. You never mentioned that. Once or twice, I said vaguely. Thomas saved me from further questioning by ordering a bottle of Bordeaux that Elizabeth had clearly selected in advance, the 1982 Chateau Margaux he specified, for the table. As the waiter departed, Judge Harrison turned the conversation to Thomas's recent promotion, Lieutenant Colonel now correct, working directly under Commander Hayes. That is quite impressive. Thomas nodded with appropriate modesty. It is an honor to serve under his command. The man is a tactical genius. I hear there is a major strategic planning session happening soon, Dr. Prescott interjected. Something about Eastern European security concerns. I kept my face neutral, though I knew exactly what they were discussing. I had helped design the framework for that very initiative before retiring. Cannot discuss the details, of course, Thomas said importantly, but yes, there are significant developments being addressed. Elizabeth beamed with pride at her husband's importance, while simultaneously glancing at me with barely concealed satisfaction at the contrast between our lives. The wine arrived, and after Thomas approved it, the waiter began pouring for everyone. When he reached me, he poured with slightly more deference, something Elizabeth immediately noticed. The wine is $1,700 a bottle, she said as the waiter moved away. I hope you can appreciate it, Natalie. I know your palate probably runs to whatever they serve at the American Legion. Judge Harrison chuckled uncomfortably while his wife studied her menu with sudden intensity. I am sure it is excellent, I replied calmly, taking a small sip. 1982 was a particularly good year for Bordeaux. Elizabeth looked momentarily surprised by my knowledge but recovered quickly. Well, when the check comes, do not feel obligated to contribute. We know government pensions are hardly generous. I smiled. That is thoughtful of you, Elizabeth. Can you even afford this place? She asked with a slight sneer, dropping all pretense of politeness. The Prix Fixe menu starts at $200 per person. Thomas looked embarrassed. Elizabeth, please. Natalie is our guest. I am simply being practical, Elizabeth replied. I would not want her to be uncomfortable. I was about to respond when I noticed a commotion near the restaurant's private dining room. The doors had opened and several uniformed military officers were visible inside. Thomas noticed as well, sitting up straighter. That is the Joint Chiefs dinner, he whispered excitedly. Commander Hayes must be here tonight. Elizabeth's attention immediately shifted from tormenting me to identifying this networking opportunity. Is that him? She asked, pointing discreetly to a silver-haired man entering the restaurant. I recognized Commander Alexander Hayes immediately. We had served together on 3 different operations, and he had been present at my retirement ceremony. For a moment, I considered excusing myself to the restroom to avoid a potentially awkward encounter, but something in me had grown tired of hiding. So I remained seated, sipping my wine, watching events unfold with the calm assessment I had applied to countless strategic situations before. Whatever happened next, I was prepared to face it with dignity. As we perused the menu, Lauren Prescott continued her line of questioning about my career, each inquiry laced with thinly veiled condescension. So, this security business of yours, she began, adjusting her diamond bracelet. Is it just you, or do you have employees? Before I could answer, Elizabeth interjected. Natalie works alone from her apartment. Very small operation, right, Natalie? I placed my menu down and met Lauren's gaze directly. I have 3 full-time consultants and a network of specialists I bring in for specific projects. We are selective about our clients. Interesting, Judge Harrison said, seeming genuinely curious. What type of clients seek your services? Again, Elizabeth attempted to answer for me. Oh, I imagine small businesses, local shops, that sort of thing. I took another sip of the excellent Bordeaux. We work with private clients, corporations, and occasionally government contractors. Much of our work involves risk assessment and strategic planning rather than physical security installations. Thomas looked up with newfound interest. Government contractors? Anyone I might know? Elizabeth shot her husband a look that clearly communicated her displeasure at his showing genuine interest in my work. Probably not, I said with a slight smile. Most of our government work is compartmentalized. The waiter returned to take our orders. When he reached me, he was notably deferential. And for you, Ma, Miss Anderson. The salmon, please, medium rare. Excellent choice. That is one of our chef's specialties, as you know. As he departed, Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. As you know, you seem unusually familiar with this place for someone who supposedly cannot afford it. Dr. Prescott, apparently sensing the tension, attempted to change the subject. Thomas, tell us more about your new position. It must be exciting working directly under Commander Hayes. Thomas straightened, clearly proud. It is an honor. The commander is implementing new intelligence protocols that will revolutionize our approach to global security. Just last month, there was an operation in Eastern Europe that successfully extracted 3 high-value assets without casualties. I maintained a neutral expression, though I had personally designed key elements of that exact operation. How fascinating, Mrs. Harrison remarked. It must be thrilling to be part of such important work. Elizabeth beamed. Thomas cannot share many details, of course, highly classified, but he has been instrumental in several critical operations. Thomas modestly demurred. I am just one part of a larger team. The real strategic minds are at the top, like Commander Hayes and his advisory staff. The sommelier appeared with a second bottle of wine, this one even more expensive than the first. Elizabeth made a show of approving it. This one is $2,300, she said, glancing meaningfully in my direction. A special vintage. Are you sure you want to open a second bottle already? I asked. The first is still half full. Elizabeth's smile tightened. We are celebrating Thomas's promotion. Cost is no object tonight. As the sommelier poured, I noticed several staff members glancing in our direction, whispering among themselves. One senior waiter was speaking to the maitre d' while looking toward our table. When the check comes, Elizabeth continued loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. We will handle it, Natalie. I know this is probably outside your budget. That is generous of you, I replied evenly, though unnecessary. Can you even afford this place? She asked bluntly, her third glass of wine apparently dissolving whatever social filters she normally maintained. Be honest. Thomas looked mortified. Elizabeth, please. What? I am simply being practical. The appetizers alone cost more than what Natalie probably makes in a day with her little security business. The table fell into uncomfortable silence. Dr. Prescott studied his wineglass intently while his wife pretended to adjust her napkin. The Harrisons exchanged glances. I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the same stillness that had served me well in crisis situations throughout my military career. While part of me wanted to reveal everything to see the shock on Elizabeth's face when she learned who I really was, another part of me questioned whether such a revelation would change anything fundamental between us. Our appetizers arrived, momentarily diffusing the tension. Elizabeth, however, was not finished. Natalie, perhaps Thomas could help you find a position with one of the security contractors his department works with. Something stable with benefits. I worry about your retirement planning. I placed my fork down gently. I appreciate your concern, Elizabeth, but my business is doing well and my retirement is secure. Is it living in that tiny apartment, driving that old car? We just want better for you. Her tone suggested charitable concern, but her eyes glittered with satisfaction at what she perceived as her superior position in life. Thomas, attempting to salvage the conversation, turned to me with genuine interest. What type of security consulting do you specialize in, Natalie? I never really asked before. Before I could answer, I noticed increased activity near the private dining room. Several uniformed officers were congregating by the entrance, and staff members were preparing for what appeared to be an important arrival. Elizabeth noticed as well, immediately shifting her attention. Is that Commander Hayes arriving? She asked Thomas eagerly. Thomas turned to look. Yes, that is him with the security detail. He must be hosting the Joint Chiefs dinner tonight. You should introduce us, Elizabeth urged, already planning her networking approach. I cannot just interrupt him during an official function, Thomas protested, though I could see he was also eager for the opportunity to impress his commanding officer. I watched as Commander Alexander Hayes entered the main dining room, flanked by two aides. At 55, Hayes was still imposing with salt and pepper hair and the ramrod posture of a career military man. He was speaking quietly to the restaurant manager, likely discussing arrangements for the private dinner. Look at all those medals, Mrs. Prescott whispered, clearly impressed. Elizabeth straightened in her chair, adjusting her hair and putting on her most charming smile, the one she reserved for potential social climbing opportunities. Perhaps he will come over if he sees you, Thomas, she suggested. Make sure you are visible. Thomas looked uncomfortable but sat taller nonetheless. I took another sip of wine and waited. Given the number of former colleagues in the restaurant tonight, I had accepted that my carefully maintained separation between my military and family lives was likely to collapse. The only question was how dramatically it would happen. The waiter arrived with our main courses, serving each dish with flourish. When he reached me, he again showed particular deference. Your salmon prepared exactly as you prefer it, he said with a slight bow. Chef Julian remembered your preference for the dill sauce on the side. Elizabeth frowned. Chef remembered. How often do you come here, Natalie? Occasionally, I replied vaguely. On a security consultant's salary, this does not add up. Her voice had risen slightly, drawing attention from nearby tables. I noticed Commander Hayes glancing in our direction, his expression changing as he recognized me. For a moment, our eyes met across the restaurant, and I gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Elizabeth, misinterpreting the exchange, hissed excitedly. Thomas, the commander is looking this way. This is your chance to introduce us. Thomas half rose from his seat, uncertain whether to approach his commanding officer or wait to be acknowledged. What happened next would change the dynamic of our family forever. The private dining room at Hamilton was clearly hosting a significant military gathering that evening. Through the briefly opened doors, I could see an impressive collection of brass and formal uniforms. American flags stood at attention on either side of a podium, and waitstaff moved efficiently, serving the distinguished guests with practiced precision. That must be the Joint Strategic Command dinner, Thomas whispered, his eyes wide with professional admiration. They only gather quarterly and attendance is by invitation only. Elizabeth immediately seized the networking opportunity, her voice dripping with calculated casualness. You must introduce us to Commander Hayes, Thomas. After all, you work directly under him now. It is not that simple, Elizabeth, Thomas replied. Though I could see he was tempted by the idea. This is clearly an official function. It would be inappropriate to interrupt. Elizabeth was undeterred. Look at the Wilsons over there, she said, nodding toward a nearby table where a man in a business suit was shaking hands with a uniformed officer. They are making connections. That is how careers advance, Thomas. Dr. Prescott leaned forward with interest. Is that General Wilson from Central Command I treated his daughter last year? Yes, Thomas confirmed. And that is Admiral Jackson by the bar and Colonel Rodriguez speaking with the maitre d'. As Thomas continued identifying the military personnel present, I remained silent, knowing each individual he named. I had served with many of them, commanded some, and been mentored by others early in my career. Several had attended my retirement ceremony 3 years ago. Elizabeth was practically vibrating with excitement at the concentration of power and influence in the room. So many important people, she murmured mentally, calculating how an association with such individuals might further elevate her social standing. That woman in the Navy pantsuit, Thomas continued, is Undersecretary Montgomery from Defense Intelligence. Absolutely brilliant strategist. I suppressed a smile, having worked directly with Montgomery on 2 classified operations in Southeast Asia. She had once described my tactical assessment as the difference between success and catastrophic failure. And there is Commander Hayes now, Thomas said, his voice dropping with respect as the commander entered the main dining room accompanied by his chief of staff and 2 security personnel. Alexander Hayes cut an impressive figure in his formal uniform adorned with medals and ribbons that told the story of a distinguished 30-year career. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and silver hair, he commanded attention without effort. His presence caused a subtle shift in the restaurant atmosphere, a collective recognition of authority that was almost palpable. Elizabeth straightened her already perfect posture, applied a fresh smile, and touched Thomas's arm. He is coming this way, she whispered urgently. This is perfect. Thomas looked both nervous and excited. He probably needs to speak with someone at another table, he cautioned. I doubt he even recognizes me outside of headquarters. Nonsense, Elizabeth insisted. You are his new intelligence officer. Of course he recognizes you. I watched Hayes scanning the room with the situational awareness that becomes second nature to those in command positions. His eyes passed over our table, then returned as recognition dawned. For a moment, I thought he might continue to his destination without acknowledging us, respecting the privacy I had maintained about my military career. Instead, he changed course and began walking directly toward our table. Elizabeth squeezed Thomas's arm in triumph. See, he recognized you. Thomas quickly stood, adopting a formal posture that bordered on attention. Commander Hayes, sir. Good evening. Hayes nodded to Thomas but continued moving until he stood directly beside my chair, his eyes fixed on me with the respect of a longtime colleague. Welcome back, General Anderson, he said in a clear, commanding voice that carried to nearby tables. It has been too long. Will you be joining us for the usual briefing tonight? The effect on our table was immediate and dramatic. Thomas's mouth fell open in shock. Dr. Prescott choked slightly on his wine. The Harrisons exchanged confused glances. And Elizabeth, who had been raising her water glass to her lips with smug satisfaction, inhaled sharply and began coughing as the water went down the wrong way. I maintained the calm demeanor that had served me through countless high-pressure situations. Good evening, Commander Hayes, I replied, standing to shake his hand. I was not planning to attend the briefing, but I am always available if needed. Hayes smiled, the expression warming his otherwise serious face. Your input would be invaluable on the Nightshade follow-up. Jefferson has been implementing your strategic framework with excellent results. Elizabeth had recovered enough from her coughing fit to stare at us in utter disbelief. General, she managed to sputter. Natalie. Hayes turned as if noticing the others at the table for the first time. My apologies for the interruption, he said formally. I did not mean to disturb your dinner. Not at all, sir, Thomas replied automatically, still looking between Hayes and me with growing confusion. Hayes returned his attention to me. The briefing starts in 20 minutes in the Monroe room. Your security clearance is still active, of course. We are discussing the implications of last month's operation and next steps. I will be there, I replied, recognizing that whatever privacy I had maintained was now irretrievably lost. Excellent, Hayes nodded to the table at large. Please excuse us. Lieutenant Colonel Walker, we will see you at headquarters on Monday. As Hayes departed with his staff, the table remained frozen in a tableau of shock and confusion. Thomas stood halfway between sitting and standing as if his military training and personal surprise were fighting for control of his body. Elizabeth was the first to break the silence. What just happened? She demanded, her voice higher than normal. Why did Commander Hayes call you General? All eyes turned to me, waiting for an explanation that would somehow make sense of the scene they had just witnessed. I sat back down, calmly took a sip of water, and decided it was finally time for the truth. The silence at our table was deafening. 5 pairs of eyes stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to dawning comprehension. Our fellow diners at nearby tables pretended not to watch while hanging on every word. Would someone please explain what is happening? Elizabeth finally demanded, her voice tight with confusion. I placed my napkin beside my plate and addressed the table calmly. I was a brigadier general in the United States Army, specializing in intelligence operations and strategic defense. I retired 3 years ago after 15 years of service. Thomas looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him, but that is impossible. I would have known if my sister-in-law was a general. I work in military intelligence. Your division was compartmentalized from mine for security reasons, I explained, and I chose not to discuss my rank or responsibilities with the family. Elizabeth's face had gone from shocked to flushed with anger. You have been lying to us for 15 years, pretending to be some low-level soldier, while secretly being a general. I never lied, I corrected her. I simply did not volunteer information about my rank or the nature of my work. Most of it was classified anyway. Dr. Prescott was looking at me with newfound respect. Brigadier General, at what age? That must make you one of the youngest to achieve that rank. 32, I replied. Yes, I was among the youngest women to reach that rank. Elizabeth seemed unable to process this information. But your apartment, your clothes, your car, nothing about you suggests. Suggests what? Elizabeth's success status, I asked quietly. Those markers have always been more important to you than to me. Thomas was slowly recovering from his shock. The nightshade operation Hayes mentioned. That was the Eastern European extraction I worked on last month. Were you involved in that? I designed the intelligence gathering phase, I confirmed. After retirement, I occasionally consult on specific operations that benefit from my expertise. Mrs. Harrison leaned forward. This is why the staff has been so deferential to you all evening. They recognize you from military functions held here. I nodded. Hamilton has hosted Joint Chiefs dinners for years. I attended dozens of strategic briefings in their private rooms. Elizabeth's shock was transforming into something harder to define, a volatile mixture of disbelief, anger, and perhaps a hint of shame. Why would you hide this from your family? She demanded. Were you ashamed of your success? The question struck me as so fundamentally backward that I almost laughed. No, Elizabeth. I was not ashamed of my success. I simply chose to keep my professional and family lives separate. But why? She persisted. I considered my answer carefully. When I first joined the military, you and our parents made it clear you thought I was wasting my potential. As I advanced, it seemed simpler to maintain that separation than to try to change perceptions that were already firmly established. Thomas was now looking at me with a mixture of awe and professional curiosity. The Anderson framework for counterintelligence operations. That was you. I nodded. We studied your protocols at the academy, he said, his voice conveying genuine respect. Your approach to the Kyrgyzstan crisis is a case study in preemptive intelligence gathering. Elizabeth turned to her husband. You knew about Natalie's work and never said anything. I knew about General Anderson's work, Thomas clarified. I had no idea that was Natalie. The materials only referenced G. Anderson, and the general's identity was not publicized for security reasons. Our conversation was interrupted by the approach of a uniformed aide. General Anderson, he said formally. Commander Hayes asked me to escort you to the briefing when you are ready. Thank you, Lieutenant, I replied. Please inform the commander I will join them shortly. As the aide retreated, Elizabeth stared at me as if seeing a stranger. So you are just going to leave our dinner for some military meeting? The briefing concerns national security matters that I have been consulting on, I explained. It would be irresponsible to decline. More important than family dinner, of course, Elizabeth said bitterly. I regarded my sister thoughtfully. Elizabeth, 10 minutes ago you were suggesting I could not afford to contribute to this dinner. Now you are upset that I have professional obligations that take precedence over a social gathering where I was clearly invited as an afterthought. Thomas winced at the accuracy of this assessment. Dr. Prescott suddenly became very interested in his wine glass while his wife and the Harrisons exchanged uncomfortable glances. That was before I knew, Elizabeth protested weakly. And that is precisely my point, I replied. Your treatment of me was based on assumptions about my success and status that were completely inaccurate. Would knowing my rank and responsibilities have changed how you valued me as a person, as your sister? Before Elizabeth could respond, I stood and addressed the table. Please excuse me. I need to attend this briefing. Thomas, it has been good seeing you. Dr. and Mrs. Prescott, Judge and Mrs. Harrison, it was a pleasure meeting you all. I turned to my sister. Elizabeth, perhaps we can continue this conversation another time when we have both had an opportunity to process tonight's revelations. As I prepared to leave, Thomas stood and automatically came to attention, a reflex action from years of military training when in the presence of a superior officer. At ease, Lieutenant Colonel, I said with a small smile. We are family after all. Thomas relaxed slightly, though his expression remained stunned. Yes, ma'am. I mean Natalie. I mean General. Natalie is fine in this setting, I assured him. Elizabeth remained, seated, her perfect posture now rigid with tension. So you are just leaving? Duty calls, I replied simply. Something I have never expected you to understand. I followed the waiting aide toward the private dining room, feeling the weight of years of unspoken truths lifting from my shoulders. Behind me, I could hear the explosion of conversation at our table, Elizabeth's voice rising with indignation, while Thomas attempted to explain the significance of what they had just discovered. Commander Hayes met me at the entrance to the Monroe room. I apologize if I compromised your privacy, General, he said quietly. I was not aware your family was uninformed about your service record. It was time for the truth to come out, I replied, though I admit I did not anticipate it happening quite so dramatically. Hayes smiled. Some operations do not go according to plan, but adaptation is what separates good strategists from great ones. Indeed, I agreed, following him into the room, where a dozen of the country's top military minds were gathered around a conference table. Ladies and gentlemen, Hayes announced General Anderson has joined us to consult on the Nightshade follow-up. Let us bring her up to speed. As I took my seat at the table, I pushed thoughts of Elizabeth and family drama aside, focusing instead on the national security matters at hand. For the next hour, I was once again General Anderson's strategist and advisor, drawing on years of experience to help shape operations that would protect American interests abroad. The skill with which I analyzed intelligence reports and suggested tactical adjustments reminded me of why I had chosen this path despite my family's disapproval. This was my calling, my purpose, regardless of whether Elizabeth or my parents ever fully understood or valued it. When the briefing concluded, I knew I needed to return to the restaurant and face the personal situation I had left behind. Some confrontations cannot be avoided, only managed with as much grace and dignity as possible. As I prepared to leave the Monroe room, Commander Hayes placed a hand on my shoulder. Your sister seemed quite shocked by the revelation of your rank. Elizabeth has always had very specific ideas about what constitutes success, I explained. Military service did not fit into that paradigm. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. In my experience, General, those who need to broadcast their achievements are often compensating for something lacking in themselves. Your quiet competence has always been your greatest strength. Thank you, Commander, I replied, appreciating his insight. Will you be available for further consultation on this matter? He asked. Of course, I assured him. My security firm's contact information remains the same. As I walked back toward the main dining room, I steeled myself for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation with Elizabeth. The truth was finally out, but whether it would improve our relationship or damage it further remained to be seen. When I returned to the main dining room, I found it significantly emptier than before. The dessert service had concluded and many diners had departed. Our table was now occupied only by Elizabeth, who sat alone with an untouched glass of dessert wine before her. Where is everyone? I asked, sliding back into my seat. Elizabeth looked up, her expression a complex mixture of emotions I could not fully decipher. Thomas took the Prescotts and Harrisons on a tour of the restaurant. Apparently, there are historical military photographs in the hallway leading to the private dining rooms that suddenly seemed fascinating to everyone. I nodded, understanding the subtext, giving us space to talk. 15 years, Natalie, she said, her voice low and tightly controlled. 15 years of lies. I never lied to you, Elizabeth, I corrected gently. I simply did not volunteer information about my rank or responsibilities. A lie of omission is still a lie, she hissed, leaning forward. Do you have any idea how you have made me look tonight? I have been treating my own sister, a brigadier general, like some kind of charity case in front of my friends and my husband's colleagues. I studied her carefully. Is that what bothers you most about this situation? How it makes you look? Elizabeth flinched as if I had slapped her. That is not fair. Is it not? I asked. Because from where I sit you seem more concerned about your social embarrassment than about the fact that you never bothered to ask meaningful questions about my life and career for the past 15 years. How could I ask about something I had no reason to suspect? She countered. You deliberately misled us all. Mom and Dad think you are barely making ends meet with your little security business. And why would you think that I challenged? Because I live in a modest apartment instead of a mansion? Because I drive a reliable car instead of a luxury vehicle? Did you ever once ask me if I was struggling financially? Elizabeth's silence was answer enough. You assumed, I continued. All of you assumed that because I did not display wealth in the ways you value, I must not have achieved success by your definition. Well, what were we supposed to think? Elizabeth demanded. You never talked about promotions or accomplishments. Did you ever ask? I repeated, even once. She looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. I asked about your work tonight and you were vague. After spending the entire evening belittling my career and suggesting I could not afford the menu, I pointed out, that was not genuine interest, Elizabeth. That was an opportunity to reinforce your sense of superiority. The truth of my words hung between us, uncomfortable but unavoidable. After a long moment, Elizabeth spoke again, her voice softer. Why did you keep it secret, really? I took a deep breath, considering how to explain decisions made over years of complex family dynamics. Do you remember when I first told the family I was joining the military? She nodded. Dad said, and I quote, No Anderson has ever served in the military. We are leaders in business and law, not cannon fodder. Elizabeth winced. He was just surprised. You had always been so academic, so analytical. The military seemed like a waste of your talents. That is exactly my point, I said. None of you could conceive that the military might actually be the perfect place for someone analytical, someone strategic, someone who wanted to serve a purpose larger than personal wealth or status. I took a sip of water before continuing. When I made lieutenant in my second year, I called home to share the news. Mom asked if that meant I would be coming back to Boston soon to start my real career. After that, it seemed easier to keep my professional life separate from family gatherings. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, processing this. But to become a general, that is extraordinary. Natalie, why would you not want to share that accomplishment? Because I did not achieve it for recognition or status, I explained. I did it because I believed in the work and the mission and the responsibility. The validation I needed came from knowing the operations I planned saved lives, protected our interests, made a difference. So we were not important enough to share it with Elizabeth, said, a hint of hurt breaking through her anger. That is not it, I sighed. By the time I made Colonel, the pattern was established. You all saw me as the family disappointment, the cautionary tale of potential squandered. And honestly, Elizabeth, it was easier to let you believe that than to challenge the narrative you had all created. That is not fair, she protested again. Isn't it, I asked. Tonight, before Hayes revealed my rank, how were you treating me, like a successful professional deserving of respect, or like someone to be pitied and subtly mocked for failing to meet the Anderson standard of success? Elizabeth had no immediate response to this, her eyes dropping to her untouched wine. Thomas returned to the table alone, his expression still showing traces of shock and awe. The others have decided to call it a night, he explained, taking his seat. They send their regards and, well, their respect, Natalie. Elizabeth shot her husband a look. You seem awfully comfortable with all this. Thomas shrugged. I am still processing, but honestly, finding out my sister-in-law is General Anderson, architect of the most innovative intelligence protocols of the last decade, that is more amazing than upsetting. You never suspected, I asked him. Never, he admitted. Though it explains why my application to your division was rerouted 3 years ago. That was your doing, wasn't it? I nodded. Conflict of interest. I had you assigned to Hayes instead. He is a better mentor for your particular skills anyway. Elizabeth looked between us, clearly frustrated by the professional rapport suddenly evident between her husband and me. So what happens now, she asked. You go back to your secret life, and we pretend tonight never happened. That depends on you, Elizabeth, I said honestly. I am no longer actively serving, though I consult occasionally. My security firm is legitimate and successful, if not as flashy as you might prefer. The question is whether you can accept me, as I am not as you assumed I was. And what about Mom and Dad? She pressed. Were you ever going to tell them? I considered it many times, I admitted. But their disappointment in my career choice was so firmly established that changing that narrative seemed unnecessary. They have their successful daughter in you. That always seemed enough. Thomas leaned forward. They should know, Natalie. They should be proud of what you have accomplished. Elizabeth nodded slowly, a new expression crossing her face that might have been the beginning of understanding. They should, she agreed quietly. For the first time that evening, I saw my sister looking at me, not with condescension or confusion, but with the dawning recognition of who I truly was. It was a small shift, but perhaps the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship. I will consider it, I promised, but on my terms and in my own time. Elizabeth nodded again, then straightened her shoulders in a gesture reminiscent of our mother, gathering her composure. We should probably go. It has been an enlightening evening. As Thomas signaled for the check, Elizabeth reached across the table and briefly touched my hand, the gesture awkward, but sincere. I am sorry, Natalie. For tonight, and for a lot of things, it seems. It was not a complete reconciliation, but it was a start. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, I felt cautiously optimistic that truth, however unexpected its revelation, might ultimately strengthen bonds that had been strained by years of misunderstanding. 1 week after the dramatic dinner at Hamilton, I found myself at our parents' home in Brookline for Sunday brunch, a monthly tradition that I usually approached with a mixture of obligation and resignation. This time, however, the atmosphere was noticeably different. I arrived to find my father in the foyer waiting for me with an expression I had rarely seen directed my way: uncertainty. At 68, Howard Anderson was still an imposing figure, his silver hair and tailored clothing projecting the authority he had wielded in courtrooms for 4 decades. Natalie, he said, his voice lacking its usual confident boom. Good to see you. Hello, Dad, I replied, accepting his awkward embrace. Your mother is in the sunroom. Elizabeth and Thomas are already here. I nodded, following him through the familiar hallways lined with family photographs chronicling generations of Anderson achievements. I noticed not for the first time how few of those photos featured my military career. There was one from my graduation from basic training tucked between Elizabeth's law school graduation and her wedding portrait. In the sunroom, my mother rose to greet me, her elegant appearance as carefully maintained as always. "Natalie, darling," she said, kissing my cheek. "We were just discussing Thomas's work with Commander Hayes." Elizabeth and Thomas sat on the wicker sofa, both looking uncomfortable but determined. Elizabeth gave me a small nod, answering my unspoken question. Yes, they had told our parents about my military rank. "Natalie," my mother continued, her voice carefully controlled, "Elizabeth has shared some rather surprising information about your military career. Is it true that you achieved the rank of general?" I took a seat across from my parents. "Yes, Brigadier General, retired 3 years ago." My father cleared his throat. "And you never thought to mention this to your family?" "I considered it many times," I replied honestly. "But it seemed unnecessary to challenge the narrative that was already established." "What narrative?" my mother asked, genuinely confused. "That my choice to join the military was a disappointment," I explained. "That I had somehow failed to live up to the Anderson legacy." My father's brow furrowed. "We never said you had failed." "Not directly," I acknowledged, "but it was implied in 100 small ways. When I made lieutenant and called home, Mom asked when I would be starting my real career. When I was deployed for the second time, Dad suggested it was not too late to apply to law school. The message was clear: military service was a detour, not a destination to be proud of." My parents exchanged glances, a silent communication honed over 45 years of marriage. "We were concerned," my mother said carefully. "The military seemed so limiting for someone with your intellect." I smiled slightly. "I commanded bases with personnel in the thousands. I managed operations with 9-figure budgets. I developed strategic frameworks that are still taught at West Point. Was that limitation, or simply a different application of my abilities than you had envisioned?" My father had the grace to look somewhat abashed. "When you put it that way," he admitted, "it sounds rather impressive." "Why did you not tell us?" my mother pressed. "We are your parents." "Because," I said gently, "my achievements were never for your approval. They were for something I believed in, something larger than family legacy or social status." An uncomfortable silence settled over the sunroom, broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Elizabeth, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "I think what Natalie is trying to say, and what I have been thinking about this week, is that we all failed to see her for who she really is, because we were too focused on our own definition of success." I looked at my sister with surprise and gratitude. This was a level of insight I had not expected from her. "At dinner last week," she continued, "I was horrible to Natalie. I treated her like a charity case, assumed she could not afford the restaurant, made condescending remarks about her career. All while she sat there having accomplished more than anyone at the table." Thomas nodded in agreement. "General Anderson, Natalie is a legend in military intelligence circles. The protocols she developed have saved countless lives. I studied her strategies at the academy without ever knowing they were created by my sister-in-law." My mother's eyes widened slightly. "Is this true, Natalie?" "Parts of my work remain classified," I said. "But yes, I made contributions I am proud of." My father leaned forward, professional curiosity overcoming his discomfort. "What exactly does a brigadier general do in intelligence operations?" For the next hour, I shared more about my military career than I had in the previous 15 years combined. I explained my specialization in intelligence strategy, described the bases I had commanded, and outlined the leadership principles I had applied. I was careful to avoid classified details, while still giving my family a clearer picture of my professional life. Throughout the conversation, I watched a gradual transformation in my parents' expressions, from confusion to interest to something that might have been pride. Elizabeth surprisingly asked the most thoughtful questions, seeming genuinely interested in understanding this dimension of my life that had been hidden for so long. As brunch concluded, my father poured coffee and regarded me with new eyes. "I owe you an apology, Natalie," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "I made assumptions about your career that were clearly uninformed and unfair." "We both did," my mother added. We should have asked more questions, shown more interest. And I could have shared more, I acknowledged. The distance went both ways. Elizabeth touched my arm tentatively. I have been thinking about something you said at the restaurant about how we treated you based on assumptions about success and status. You were right. I never asked about your work, because I assumed it could not compare to what I considered achievement. I smiled at my sister, seeing her perhaps more clearly than I ever had before. We all have different paths, Elizabeth. Yours brought you success by conventional standards, and there is nothing wrong with that. Mine took a different direction. But equally valuable, she admitted. Maybe more so. You were protecting the country while I was planning charity galas. Both have their place, I assured her. After brunch, Elizabeth suggested we take a walk in the garden, a private conversation away from our parents and Thomas. As we strolled among our mother's prize roses, she seemed to be gathering courage to say something. Natalie, she finally began, I am starting a new community initiative for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. Would you consider being an advisor? Your experience would be invaluable. The request was unexpected and touching a genuine olive branch. I would be happy to help, I told her. And maybe we could have coffee sometimes, she added. Just the two of us. I realize there is so much about your life I know nothing about. I would like that, I said sincerely. 3 days later, Elizabeth and I met at a small cafe near my office. The awkwardness of our new dynamic was still present, but there was also an openness that had been missing from our relationship for decades. Your security firm, she said after we had settled with our drinks. Tell me about it really. What kind of work do you do? And so I explained my business in detail, describing our clients, our approach to security consulting, and how my military experience informed my civilian work. Elizabeth listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that showed genuine interest rather than judgment. You know, she said thoughtfully, I always thought I was the successful sister. It never occurred to me that you might have been quietly achieving more significant things than I could imagine. Success is not a competition, Elizabeth, I told her, and it certainly is not measured by who has the bigger house or the more impressive title. She smiled ruefully. That is a lesson I am only beginning to learn at 42. You figured it out much earlier. We all have our blind spots, I said. Mine was assuming the family could never see beyond their preconceptions of me. Elizabeth reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I am trying to see more clearly now. As we parted, promising to meet again the following week, I reflected on the unexpected gift that had come from the dramatic revelation at Hamilton. The truth had not only freed me from the burden of secrecy, but had also opened the possibility of a more authentic relationship with my family. I had spent 15 years believing that my achievements would never matter to those closest to me because they did not fit a predetermined definition of success. In doing so, I had underestimated their capacity for growth and understanding, just as they had underestimated me. The lesson perhaps was that we all create stories about each other based on limited information and our own biases. Breaking free of those narratives requires courage and honesty, but the reward is the possibility of truly seeing and being seen. As I walked back to my office, I felt lighter than I had in years. The path forward with my family would not be without challenges, but for the first time in my adult life, I felt that they were beginning to see me as I truly was, not as they had assumed me to be. That recognition, I realized, was worth more than any rank or title could ever be. Have you ever had someone in your life who completely misjudged you based on appearances or assumptions? How did it feel when they finally saw the real you? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a reminder not to judge others by surface appearances. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that often the most extraordinary people are those who do not feel the need to broadcast their achievements. Until next time.